My name is Shelby Little. That's Shelby Little, and I'm with the Williamson County Grays, camp number 502, Sons of Confederate Veterans here in Georgetown.
Fabulous. So Shelby, I want to talk to you a little bit about your roots here in Georgetown as well as the monument's roots. Can you tell me what made you want to join the organization that you're representing today?
Well, like many people, I think that as you get a little older in life, you start thinking about the people that came before you, especially in your own family, and you have more time to explore those roots. And so I was 40 years old whenever I really got started into looking at my own genealogy and looking at organizations that were interested in sharing that with other folks.
And although you were 40 years old when this happened, this monument has been around since 1916. A large portion of its history is embedded here in Georgetown. Can you talk to me a little bit about what this monument means to you, to your organization, and to a large amount of people here in the city?
Well, we get that question a lot, Abigail, and what we typically will do is we gesture to the memorial and say what is written in stone on the front of it. It is in memory of the Confederate soldiers and sailors erected under the auspices of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1916. It's a memorial to American veterans who happen to be our kinfolk.
And so it's, again, a large part of the history here in Georgetown. Can you talk to me about what it would mean to you, or, the symbolism, how it would hurt you if this were to come down?
Well, it's as you well know, over these past several years, it hasn't been confined to the Confederates. They're the low-hanging fruit. But all American history and associated monuments have been under attack, and many of them have indeed been either destroyed or taken down. One of the things that bothers us the most is not the destruction, but the removal of the Confederate Reconciliation Memorial in Arlington National Cemetery that the U.S. Army took down earlier here in the spring. That is the direct slap in the face to American veterans and goes against everything that memorial was erected to represent. It was dedicated by President Wilson in 1914.
For you, when you hear organizations calling to remove these monuments, does it feel like an attempt to erase history, particularly yours?
Yes, it does, and that's probably one of the more common comments that we get from folks here on the square. We've been out here almost every Saturday since June of 2020. That's a long period, but that's the most common thing we see and hear, is that history is history. Even from people who have nothing good to say about the Confederacy, they recognize it as historical fact. It did happen.
And on that note, some people, the people who are calling to remove this Confederate statue and others that exist in Central Texas, they say that it's hurtful to remember the Confederacy and what it stood for. What's your response to that?
Well, again, that's one of the main things that we are out here to debunk, that this is a part of history that was very complicated. And yes, there are people who are going to be offended one way or the other, no matter what is said. But they have to understand that this was a fight for independence, just like the American colonists in 1776, just like the Texas colonists in 1836. The only difference is the Confederates lost their war, and we have been paying for it ever since, up until the present time.
I want to touch on, could you explain that a little bit, paying for it ever since?
Well, of course, there was the very difficult period of Reconstruction for 12 years after the war ended. Most people don't know that Texas was not allowed back into the Union until March of 1870. And before that, former Confederates were disenfranchised. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office. They were under martial law, not just in Texas, but throughout the South.
And so when you see a statue like this, what does it represent for you?
Well, we look up there, that is not Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee on top. It's a, what we would call it, a common Confederate soldier. Now this fellow, he just happens to be a white guy. But especially here in Texas, the Confederate Army was composed of whites, blacks, Hispanics, Indians, Jews, across the board. And they were not segregated into special units. They were integrated into regular Confederate units, seven companies were formed here in Williamson County. Our namesake, the Williamson County Grays, was here in October 1861, went off to fight the New Mexico-Arizona campaign. And most people don't know there was a New Mexico-Arizona campaign, but they have a very illustrious history.
And the same could be said about Williamson County and here in Georgetown as well. I talked to you a little bit earlier and I let you know that I wasn't able to hear from anyone on the Commissioner's Court as well as the county judge. Why do you think that is?
Well, it continues to be a sensitive political issue, that there are not many folks who are willing to stand up and be proponents for the preservation of anything Confederate. So I understand their political concerns about that. As you probably know, Williamson County is probably more and more purple than it used to be, and so it's a concern politically. If I were a commissioner, it wouldn't bother me any, but I understand their hesitations.
But if you had to guess, would you assume that they would be willing to take this monument down, or do you kind of know where they stand on the issue?
I think I know where they stand on the issue. Again, I have spoken with them on numerous occasions in open Commissioner's Court every Tuesday, and even though they are not allowed by law to comment, their method and what they have done during these last 4 years have made it clear to me that the majority of the court would favor just leaving it where it is.
Absolutely, sir. And one of my last questions for you is, for people who don't understand the symbolism of this monument, or for people who think this is a representation of hatred and racism and hurt, what would you say to them?
Well, I would say do a little research on your own. What we tell everybody who comes up to us, don't believe a word we say. Don't believe anything on this paper that we give to you about facts regarding the war. We invite you to take something there, and if it's of interest to you, look at it and research it. The truth is there. Do not just listen to the talking heads or others who are disdainful of our history. And of course, as you well know, we have a lot of folks, not only in Travis County, but all over Central Texas, all over Texas in general, that are recent arrivals here in Texas. They know little to nothing about Texas history, and the same thing applies to Williamson County history. Most people don't know that this was the frontier in 1860. You know, across Austin Avenue there, that's Indian territory. That was a big thing because the war here in Texas was nothing like the war in Virginia or Georgia or Alabama. So it was a different kind of thing, which led to the innovation in how we defended the state very successfully.
And Shelby, is there anything else that you want to add that maybe I haven't yet asked you?
Well, I just want to stress the fact that this war was fought for independence. And we hear a lot of the slavery thing and whatnot. That's one of their favorite talking points. But the truth of the matter is, at the end of the war, in the summer of 1865, who had the slaves? It was the United States. During all this 4 years of incredible carnage, they could have freed all the slaves in the United States at any time. They chose not to do so. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the South, and of course, that didn't happen until '65. But it didn't free the slaves in the North. So it's a hypocritical thing. It's a false argument, and that's their favorite punchline. Is it's all about slavery and how we are, trying to continue to promote it, and that's far, far from the truth.
I'm glad you said so. And just a follow-up question to that: for people who argue that the Civil War was based on slavery, what's your response to that?
Well, that it's just not a true statement. That they can look, if they would just, and we keep copies of this on our table. Would you like to see a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation? Do you know about it? Oh yes, well we know that Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, look down to paragraph 3 or 4 and see if he did or not. he specifically excludes certain people. The slaves in the North, the slaves in the area that is occupied by the Union Army on January 1st, 1863. So it's like the British say, that are said back then, that he freed the slaves he couldn't, didn't free the slaves he could. So what's the deal? It was strictly a war measure, as Mr. Lincoln said it was, to try to, number one, create a slave insurrection in the South, which would cause the Confederate armies to disintegrate, to go back and take care of that. And that just didn't happen that way. And of course, he also wanted reinforcements for his army, which was bleeding profusely at that time.
Thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button and get the latest news by downloading the CBS Austin News app.